Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this, students. This is my AP Macroeconomics remote learning video over the Phillips Curve, both the short run and long run elements, which, oh god, yeah, there's a long run element to this. So for this graph, what you need to be have at the forefront of your brain is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. If you need to go back into your notes and review that a little bit to be like, okay, so here's what changed aggregate demand, here's what changed aggregate supply, here's what that looked like, here's that kind of thing. I'll pull up a bell ringer problem for you as a sort of tester. So here's this bell ringer problem. Let me have this on my screen and then show it to y'all. That's not it. There's the button. Solve through this problem. If you can solve through this, you'll be ready to go for the entirety of the lecture today, short run and long run. So in the short run, an increase in foreign demand for American products will result in what changes to inflation rate and unemployment rate? Use the ADAS graph to find your answer. Remember, price level and inflation have a positive correlation because inflation is an overall increase in price level. And that unemployment and GDP have an inverse relationship, as GDP is a means of production, so when production goes up, you would assume unemployment is going down. Additionally, the second part of this is what will happen in the long run if the government chooses to not be particularly involved. Let's say this economy is starting at full employment. So pause the video and work through the problem. I'm going to draw it. And unpause. Okay, so I keep using that weird filter, that sucks. All right, so here's the problem setup. We've got aggregate supply graph at full employment, LRA is right through the middle, price levels my y-axis, real GDP is my x-axis. Great so far. Increase in foreign demand for American products. Okay, people want more of our stuff. They are demanding more. It says demand there, that helps me out. This is an aggregate demand change. What's technically happening is that exports are going up. Remember that aggregate demand is made up of CIGXN, net exports. Exports going up, great. Aggregate demand is rising in the United States. So here's what my graph would look like if I did that shift, bingo, bango, bongo. I'm up here now. So up on this higher point on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, I now have a higher real GDP and a higher price level. The question asked me, what happens to unemployment and inflation rate? Okay, well, GDP went up, so unemployment rate's going to go down, because if we're making more stuff, making more money, we can hire more people. We're producing more, great. And price level went up, so inflation goes up. Sort of my key to what just happened here. So I've got a higher level of inflation and a lower level of unemployment, right? That makes sense. We're producing more, so things are going to get more expensive, but we're producing more, so we're spending more, so things get more expensive, but we're also spending more and making more money, so we can hire more people, so unemployment will go down. Great. Question asks, what happens in the long run if the government doesn't do anything? This is the long run self-adjustment thing, which is, if the government ain't going to fix it, that means businesses have to. If businesses are going to fix it, it's going to be an SRAS shift. Now, what's happening here that could cause that? Well, remember that in the long run, prices and wages are flexible now. They can change. We just mentioned that inflation's happening, that everything's getting more expensive. Well, it would make sense to start paying your workers a bit more then, right? If everything's getting more expensive, you should start to increase the wages of your workers so that they can afford stuff. Great. But if you do that, if you start paying your workers more as a business, you're going to have to cut some costs in places. Namely, you might have to lay off some of those workers that you just hired, or you might have to cut some capital, things like that. So the long run situation, the long run shift would be this. A decrease in SRAS to get us back to long run equilibrium. Remember, that's from Unit 3. It's been about a month since we did that. But that's crazy important. So my SRS will shift back to the original spot. I get a much higher inflation rate in the long run, but my unemployment rate in the long run doesn't actually change, right? I go back to my original level of GDP. We hired more people and then fired them in the long run, so who cares? But inflation did go up. Prices did end up higher. And I mentioned that this is kind of what happens over time in our economy, that generally speaking, we see this upward sort of pull on prices over time. That's why we have inflation just about every single year, because our demand is kind of constantly rising. And that's for a lot of reasons, namely, incomes do keep going up on average, and population is going up. Those are two big demand shifters, income and population. So that'll rise more spending, leading to higher prices. Not too crazy, right? That's all review. But that will get into what we're talking about today, which is, let's go to this. Nope, I keep picking that. Why? The Phillips Curve! We got a new graph! Okay, this is the only graph for Unit 5, so count your blessings. We only have one more graph left after this one, so we are almost done with the graphs, I promise, guys. There's 6 of them. We've covered 4. We took care of 2 of them last unit. We've only got 2 more left. This one and 1 more. You can do it. I believe in you. If what I just did made sense to you, if you're like, it's like clicking in your brain like, oh yeah, I remember that stuff, especially the inflation, unemployment stuff, this graph, you'll be just fine. If that didn't make any sense to you, I'm going to go back and watch those videos again and refresh yourself on that stuff. Okay. The Phillips Curve. So the Phillips Curve is the brainchild of a guy whose last name is Phillips. His name is William Phillips, or A.W. Phillips. He's from New Zealand. He went to the London School of Economics. He's a massive nerd. He looks like he studied economics for a living. And he had a crazy idea, which is to say, an idea that isn't that crazy and frankly made a lot of sense and was sort of the de facto idea for a long time. That idea is simple, and it's the function of the Phillips Curve. It's the main idea behind the Phillips Curve. And here's the main idea. Write this down. The Phillips Curve is based on the concept that inflation rate and unemployment rate are inversely related variables. That inflation and unemployment are inversely related. The idea being, as unemployment rate goes down, which means functionally more people have jobs, right? Lower unemployment rate means more people have jobs. More people will have money and be spending that money, and more spending leads to inflation. So less unemployment, more inflation. Less unemployment, more inflation, because less unemployment means more spending, so more spending means higher prices. With me so far? Conversely, if we have higher unemployment, people are losing their jobs, they don't have as much money, they can't spend money, so prices start to fall. So when unemployment goes up, inflation goes down. This all logically checks out. You're like, okay, this seems about right. So what I've got presented on the screen is data that A.W. Phillips collected back in the 60s in the United States to sort of see if he was right. He's like, this is my thing, I think this is right, it sounds right, right? And I was like, yeah, it sounds right. Do you have data for it? He's like, yeah, I'm going to get some data. So he gets data in the 60s in the United States, and he's like, sick. Because if he did a line of best fit here, he'd be like, wait a minute. This, it is downward sloping. Downward sloping means it's inverse on a graph, in case you can't tell. Because at a very high inflation rate, you would have a very low unemployment rate. At the lowest unemployment rate, you have the highest inflation rate. And at the highest unemployment rate, you have just about, pretty dang close to the lowest inflation rate. So we get the Phillips Curve. Specifically, this is the short-run Phillips Curve. There is a long-run component here, which we'll get to how that happened in a second. So we've got the short-run Phillips Curve. Now, the short-run Phillips Curve is very similar to our aggregate demand aggregate supply model in that it is a snapshot of an economy. And what I mean by that is, basically, I can tell how your economy is doing based on where you are on the Phillips Curve. If you are right up here, I can tell the problem your economy is facing is inflation. You are probably in, wait for it, guys, an inflationary gap. Like on the aggregate demand supply model. Oh my God, they're connected. Yeah, they're connected. And if you're down here and you've got 1% inflation and 7% unemployment, I'd wager that the bigger of the two problems is probably unemployment, right? So you could easily be in a recessionary gap down there. Oh my God, again, the aggregate demand supply model. Yeah. So yeah. Basically, we'll tell how your economy is doing based on where on the Phillips Curve are they. Are they in the middle? Are they at the very end at the bottom? Are they up at the very top? Because that'll tell me if their economy is a lot of inflation, a lot of unemployment, or a bit of both. Here, less than 5% unemployment, less than 2% inflation. Hell yeah, this point's awesome. And frankly, even these points, this point's oh no, 3.5% and 4%, it's fine. 7%, that's fine. The 60s, our economy was doing really well. So this is America's doing great health economically. This is pretty good. Now, when it says the role of supply shocks, remember that supply shocks are a shift in the aggregate supply curve. Yeah, that's better. I'm going to clear up the bubbles. Shift in the aggregate supply curve. Here's how this graph will work functionally for us. When we just did that aggregate supply shift at the very beginning, the bell ringer, I wrote down that unemployment rate and inflation rate got changed by that shift, right? If you have it still, go back to it. But the idea was we increased aggregate demand, which led to, in the short run, sticking with the short run because it's a short run curve, a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate. Effectively, this is what had happened on our graph. An increase in AD led to higher prices and less unemployment. Well, guess what, guys? Those two things are on this graph. Oh my God. Can I graph that on here too? Yes, you can graph it on here. Spoiler, that's the whole thing. So let's say we were here. Let's say that's full employment. Let's say that that's where our economy was supposed to be, like at the very beginning of our last problem. We like started at full employment, and we had that shift, and we ended up at, and we were at that point. So this is the same point as our equilibrium point on our demand supply curve. It's just on the Phillips curve instead. This is not a supply and demand curve. This is what is different about the Phillips curve. It's not a supply and demand graph. So there isn't an equilibrium to think of in this respect. So we're here. I now have a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate. Where am I now? My Phillips curve. Did I move up or down the curve? Well, I got higher inflation and lower unemployment. I'd be like up here probably, right? Somewhere like that. Yes. This is how the Phillips curve works. And this is the thing to write down, but I have a slide for it. When you change aggregate demand, you move along the Phillips curve. A change in aggregate demand kind of proves Phillips right. Or when you change aggregate demand, it shows that inflation and unemployment are inversely related variables. Whoa, crazy, so cool, love it, yay. So a higher aggregate demand will lead to more spending, so less unemployment, good. Higher inflation, not as good. But that matches the graph from the aggregate demand supply graph, right? We had a higher price level, means higher inflation. We had higher GDP, which means less unemployment. Those relationships are the crux of this graph. This graph is based on those relationships. That when GDP goes up, unemployment goes down. When price level goes up, inflation goes up. You gotta get those. Now, why it says supply shocks here is because supply shocks ruined Phillips' life. They ruined his freaking theory. And this is how I'll show it to you. So do a quick, baby, tiny sketch of an aggregate demand supply graph. You don't have to have the long run on it. Just do a real quick ADAS graph. No long run, just SRAS and AD. Price level, real GDP, like that. So we're looking at that graph. Let's decrease aggregate supply. Let's cause stagflation. Let's decrease aggregate supply. Remember I mentioned stagflation is like the worst case scenario for your economy? So decrease your aggregate supply curve. And then jot down what happened to GDP and price level. I decrease my aggregate supply curve. So my GDP is now lower. Real GDP went down. And my price level went up. Right, this is the whole reason why it sucks, is that you have less spending and higher prices. You're like, oh God, this is terrible. So real GDP goes down and price level goes up. Let's translate that to the Phillips curve. So real GDP goes down. That means that my unemployment rate is going up. Right, we're spending less, making less money, so we can't afford as many workers. So unemployment rate's going up. Price level's going up, so inflation rate is also going up. Wait a minute. This is right. My relationships are right based on this graph. This is what's happening. What was Phillips' theory again? That unemployment and inflation are inversely related? But wait. Oh my God, he was wrong sometimes. People are wrong times? Yes, people are wrong sometimes. Phillips messed up, but here's how he figured it out. Watch this big brain move he did. If I'm on my Phillips curve and I was trying to show a higher unemployment rate and a higher inflation rate, what might I do? I'd have to move that point like diagonally and up to the right. It'd be off the curve. That doesn't help me at all, unless I shift the curve. Philip, you rascal. Look at this. Look at this guy. Effectively, we go from this point to this point. A negative supply shock, a decrease in supply, shifts my entire Phillips curve over. What he's saying there is basically when you change the aggregate supply curve, you sort of change the entire framework of your economy. Because what it means for you to be producing is like a different definition of production when you change the aggregate supply curve. Remember that aggregate supply is like your ability to produce things. So he's like, in that case, your economy is kind of entirely different. So you've got an entirely different Phillips curve. And then we're like, well, what about aggregate demand? He's like, don't worry about it. I'm like, all right, Philip. So we move the entire Phillips curve when you change SRAS. When it says the role of supply shocks, the role of supply shocks is that they shift your SRPC. Here's the nice thing. They shift in the opposite direction. I shifted my SRAS to the left. I moved my Phillips curve technically up to the right, but rightward. Right? I decreased my SRAS, so I'm increasing my Phillips curve. That's the way to think about it. And it's always going to work like that. It actually worked like that for the demand thing, too. I increased aggregate demand, and I moved to the left, oh my god, along my Phillips curve. So I'm kind of always moving them in opposite directions. That's because of this. The unemployment rate's inversely related with the x-axis on my aggregate demand supply graph, so when I move stuff to the right on that graph, I should move stuff to the left on this graph, right? Okay. Oh, and if I did a positive supply shock, if I increased supply, my Phillips curve would go down. Here's the thing to be aware of with the Phillips curve. It can go through your x-axis because you could have a negative inflation rate. That just means prices are going down. That happens. It's not common, but it can happen. It can't go through the y-axis. Like if I'm shifting it to the left, do not draw it like this. Why? You can't have negative unemployment. Yeah. You can't have greater than 100% employment. That doesn't track. There's no way for that to like logically happen. What are you like counting robots as people and then employing them, but then it would still be 100% at max. It doesn't. Okay. So here's sort of our list of things that shift the Phillips curve, written down handy dandy style for you in case you needed to have it. A change in AD moves us along our SRPC. Drew that. We increased AD gets higher inflation, lower unemployment, so we move up along my SRPC. A change in SRAS will shift the Phillips curve. So when I decreased SRAS, I moved my Phillips curve to the right, take the whole thing and move it. There's a third one, the wild card. This one exists too, which is a change in expected inflation rate. It shifts it. I can keep it real simple. I can go complicated on you. I'll keep it medium simple. Because this is one that shows up less frequently. And because things can get really tricky with this, I try to keep it fairly simple on students. If the complicated things what a College Board wants, take them as on the point. It's not worth giving you the headache that is caused by it. The idea is if we expect more inflation, we cause it. Which logically does actually check out. If you think prices are going to go up tomorrow, what are you going to do today? Spend. Cool. What does that cause? Prices to go up. Crap. You've caused the inflation. That's the idea on a global scale. So, if we expect more inflation, it will cause more inflation. So what you do on the graph is if I expect 3% more inflation, let's say I'm starting right here, I'm going to literally move everything up. Oh god, it got frozen there. Stop freezing. There we go. I'm going to literally move it up 3. Across the board at every level, because no matter what the unemployment rate was, we're going to get 3% more inflation. You can technically think of this as like a increase in demand, decrease in supply, long-run self-adjustment, double shift thing if you really have to, but for what I would just tell you is if you see that inflation goes up, you move it up. What determines this? Data. Data is what will tell us the expected inflation rate. We look at projections based on current levels of spending to tell what expected inflation is going to be, and it can affect our spending. This is also why you don't see inflation publicized a ton, especially expected inflation. It is not a heavily published thing because it affects consumer behavior a ton, especially if they know what the hell is happening. If you hear that there's expected to be a 3% increase in inflation next year, you might be prompted to spend more, which could throw off the projection. It could actually cause it to be more. Because if more people spend than they expected it to, oh crap, we've caused more inflation than we want. Dang it! So yeah, that's the thing. But that inflation causes inflation. When you hear about inflation, you're more likely to do behaviors that cause it. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are great. Okay, so here's a set of practice questions. Just to see if you know how to manipulate the short-run Phillips curve. So draw what will happen on the Phillips curve after each of the following situations. We've got an increase in government spending, a decrease in exports, an increase in, they should say like production technology, like machinery, things like that. You can think of it as capital. And an increase in expected inflation rate. So draw what happens on the Phillips curve. As a general tip, whenever you see a Phillips curve problem, a sort of checklist to do first is this an aggregate demand or aggregate supply shift? If it is, it's a good idea to draw that first. And then write what happened to unemployment and GDP, or unemployment and inflation, and then make that happen on your Phillips curve. I'll do that for a couple of these. Sort of show you what I mean by drawing both graphs and sort of like emphasizing it. If you get good enough at this, you won't have to draw both and you'll be able to like just sort of picture it. But I can only do that because I've drawn these graphs 8 bajillion times. This is my 5th year teaching this course. So I'm going to do a real quick small baby sketch. If you want to do a couple of small baby sketches too of your aggregate and aggregate supply curves, long run is not involved yet, so don't worry about drawing your long run aggregate supply line. It hasn't come up yet on this. Your Phillips curve, again, it's unemployment rate. You really can't abbreviate your Phillips curves axes kind of at all, as a heads up. Like, don't do IR for inflation rate because IR is interest rate, and whoops-a-daisy, that's a different graph. So especially on your Phillips curve, I would not abbreviate your axes. It is crazy important. So first things first, we've got an increase in government spending. Okay, when you think of that's an aggregate demand supply curve thing, oh, that for sure is. Government spending is the G in CIGXN. Remember that aggregate demand is changed by spending. Oh, increase in government spending. That's a spending thing. So aggregate demand is going up. We've already drawn this. This is the first one that I drew. But if you want a visual of what I'm talking about, of like, how do I draw a shift on the Phillips curve, you just pick 2 points and draw an arrow. You can pick wherever the points are for your start. But I would do something along these lines. Here's my sort of like checklist. AD goes up, GDP up, unemployment rate goes down, price level went up, inflation goes up. So like this is sort of what's going on in my brain. Here is my aggregate demand supply curve. I drew the increased aggregate demand. I wrote off to the side what happened to all my stuff. AD goes up, GDP went up, unemployment went down because GDP went up, and price level went up, so inflation went up. So I'm focusing on this. That's what I'm looking at. I'm going to look at that. I'm going to make that happen on my Phillips curve. Okay, I got my original point, which I just picked in the middle to be like nice and safe about it. And I needed a higher inflation and a lower unemployment, so I just moved up along the line to get there. Remember, changing AD moves you along your Phillips curve. So, boom, made it happen. 2 is a decrease in exports. That's the opposite. That's a decrease in aggregate demand. So you'd move down along your Phillips curve. Opposite direction. I'll do a quick, bit, tiny sketch of that. The purple line that I've drawn will do it. AD went down. Real GDP did exactly the opposite of the last problem. So like all the things that were in green, flip them all around on that. But I'll write it anyway just so you have a visual of it. So like the purple. Oh, here we go. So that purple shift is decreased in aggregate demand. I've got this stuff happening, lower real GDP, higher unemployment rate, lower price level, higher inflation rate, and this shift down along my Phillips curve. Then we get to number 3, an increase in production technology. Again, I should type more on that, make that a little bit more clear. Production-based technology. That is an aggregate supply shifter. Your ability to produce things is what aggregate supply represents. So if we have an increase in productive technology, okay, well then we can produce more. So my aggregate supply curve should, what class? Oh no, Mr. McRitchie, you're not here. That is an increase in my aggregate supply curve. So I increase aggregate supply, I shift that to the right. Okay, check with yourself. Increasing aggregate supply does what to GDP, unemployment, inflation, and price level? Go through that yourself while I write it. Think about it. We are producing more. So that's what SRAS going up means. So we're producing more. What should happen to GDP? What should happen to unemployment rate? What should happen to price level? And what should happen to inflation? So let's check your work. So I've increased my supply curve, shifted it over to the right. Looks like I've got a lower price level at equilibrium and a higher GDP at equilibrium. That's what I'm focusing on for the stuff, in case you couldn't ever tell. Looking at my equilibrium point. Here to there. Those 2 points. So now, I've got a higher GDP and a lower price level. Great. Higher GDP means lower unemployment. We're producing more. We're hiring more people. We've got less unemployment. Great. Well, we're producing more, but people don't necessarily want things more. So if I make more of a thing, people want it the same, I'll have to start charging less for it. So prices are going down. Price level is lower. Inflation rate is lower. They're both decreasing. Well, they're both decreasing. What the hell do I do to my Phillips curve? I would take my original point, say it's right there, and I'd move it to a place where the statement would be true, which is off the curve. Because if I need a lower inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate, I'd have to go like there. Right? I have to get lower on both of those things. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to draw a new Phillips curve through that point. SRPC1. I shifted my Phillips curve to the left. That's the idea. Decrease your Phillips curve. Shifted it down / to the left. I increased the SRAS, so I decreased the Phillips curve. Again, move them in opposite directions. I moved SRAS to the right, I moved Phillips curve to the left. And then an increase in expected inflation rate, that's what we just talked about, which is if we expect more inflation, we cause it. While this technically could be like an aggregate demand, aggregate supply thing, it's technically both aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which is why I say to just ignore it, to be honest. You technically shift both lines, then have to track the equilibriums and everything. It gets really complicated. For this one, it's just we expect more inflation. Inflation goes up. I move my entire Phillips curve up. I would still draw it with a rightward arrow, even though I am literally moving it upward. Just because as a habit, you should always be going left and right. This is the only graph where like an up arrow might actually be more appropriate, but just don't even bother. Should just look like that. Rightward shift. Oh boy. Yeah, there we go. SRPC1 is the new one on the right. Moved it over to the right. Bingo, bungo, bongo. That's number 4. Okay. That's all short run. My evil smile should tell you there's more to it than just that. There is a long run component. So, this was his data in the 60s, right? Mentioned that. Great. So we had the SRPC of the 60s. In the 70s, America goes through kind of a lot of economic crises all at once. We get involved in the Middle East, and the oil in the Middle East becomes kind of a big deal. We have an oil crisis. We have stagflation. A bunch of things go crazy. And it raises some questions about the trade-off and relationship between inflation and unemployment. And how I'm going to show that. So I'm going to show you the data from the 70s over the data from the 60s. So when you look at this 20-year period, Phillips' theory kind of gets like smacked real hard in the face. As this period of crazy economic turmoil led to things like stagflation, which is this dot right here. Oh, sweet Jesus, look at this dot. Almost 10% unemployment and almost 10% inflation. Jesus, that's not good. That one, crazy actually. Wow, that's cool. Does not seem sustainable at all, but dang, 1% unemployment, 1% inflation, what the hell's going on there? You go all over the place in this decade. What this tells us, roll my eyes at it, is that in the long run, over long periods of time, like 20 years long, these variables don't super have a relationship. That if I were to draw a line of true whatever through this, the closest I would get would be, it'd have to be in the middle, because that's where most of the points are condensed. Like there are a majority of the points in this sort of box right here. I couldn't even really do a diagonal up or down. It may be like a even down, but it wouldn't be much. So they're just like, screw it. We've got a long run Phillips curve. This should actually logically make sense based on the LRAS stuff, which is that we mentioned that in the long run, our economy sort of always gravitates to that vertical line. That we kind of always go back to that level of GDP, no matter what happened to price level. That is the exact same idea here. Remember that GDP and unemployment are like two sides of a coin. This line is quite literally full employment. Just like the LRAS represented full employment on your SRAS AD graph, LRPC represents full employment here. It's just a little more obvious that it's full employment because this is unemployment rate. Now we've mentioned that there is an ideal unemployment rate. There is full employment. It's called the natural rate of unemployment, although there's a better version of it called the NAIRU. This came up back in Unit 2. It's been like 2 months since we covered this, so if you forgot it, understand. But there's an ideal level of unemployment for us. I mentioned that it's usually around 5%. It's like a nice little sort of number for it. Between 4 and 5% is typically where our NAIRU is at. The LRPC is drawn at that amount, literally, because the unemployment rate is your x-axis, and this is an unemployment rate. So if they tell you the NAIRU, or the natural rate of unemployment, which is another way to say it without as many words, is like 4%, and there's a 4 on that x-axis, you draw the vertical line at 4. That is where LRPC is going to be. You could shift it. This is the like one tiny bullet of this LRPC, the vertical line can shift. It is possible because the NAIRU, same as the natural rate, is made up of just the structural and frictional unemployment. That is unemployment due to your job becoming obsolete, and unemployment due to you wanting to move to a new place or moving to a new like job or career. Both of those are good, healthy types of unemployment that should happen in your economy if those amounts changed for whatever reason. If those amounts changed for whatever reason, then we would move the LRPC. Now, so let me sort of give you a visual of how this will work. Let's go big cam. Okay. This is going to require a drawing, so this is all graph stuff. So I'm going to draw the long run Phillips curve sort of in practice. And we're going to use the problem from the bell ringer that I did. I'm just going to graph that entire problem on my Phillips curve. Just getting the drawing out. So if you want to, you can draw along with me, or at least pause when I draw this and draw this in your notes as well. So here is my drawing. I've got SRPC and LRPC. I've got inflation rate, unemployment rate. This is my Phillips curve drawing with a long run. Now, it should be mentioned that I don't have to start at equilibrium here. This is not a supply and demand graph, so there is not a guarantee that I am starting like right here. That isn't something that necessarily has to happen. If I am here, it means that I am at full employment. Think about that with your aggregate demand supply curve. That would be like if SRAS and AD had LRAS right through the middle of the start. Right? That's the perfect situation. It means where you currently are, which is the point on the SRPC where we are, is where we're supposed to be. Great. So let's say this is it, because that's what we were in the bell ringer. The bell ringer was starting at full employment. Right? The bell ringer said that there is an increase in aggregate demand. What happens on the Phillips curve in the short run? What happens on it in the long run is what I'm going to draw here. So increase in AD, we just did this, is going to cause my SRPC, I'm going to move along it, because it's an aggregate demand change. I'm going to move along it, up it. So I increase aggregate demand, I should get a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate. If you got to draw the aggregate demand supply graph to figure that out, go for it. You just need practice on it. That's all you need. So we increase aggregate demand, so my Phillips curve would look like this. I have moved off my long run equilibrium. That matches what happened on my aggregate demand supply graph. I'm going to do a teeny baby sketch of that aggregate demand supply graph that we had. A teeny tiny baby sketch to give you sort of a reference of what I'm talking about here, where these two graphs will effectively mirror each other. That's how I like to think of it. I think of them as this kind of reflects what's happening on my Phillips curve. So we increased AD. Oh god, I can't get this marker's cap off. There we go. Let's call that point A, that point B. That's point A, that's point B. Okay. So down here, right. Increased AD, higher price level, higher GDP. So this is what's happening on my Phillips curve. This is, if I were to draw what happens on both graphs, forgot my arrow. There we go. If we're to draw what happens on both graphs after an increase in aggregate demand, including my long run Phillips curve, this is what's happening. This graph is showing me what? Well, now I'm in an inflationary gap. I've increased inflation past full employment. Cool, what's happening here? The same thing. Look at that. My inflation is now higher. Oh, God. Okay. Now, on the bell ringer, we said, what happens in the long run? Which is the long run economy that self-corrects, right? The government doesn't get involved, means businesses fix it, so SRAS shifted back to the left. Remember that whole long run self-adjustment thing that everybody understood and that no one had any problems with because it makes perfect sense every time. This is me being very sarcastic. I've asked every economics teacher if I teach it right. They're like, yes. I'm like, oh God. It's that confusing every time. They're like, mm-hmm. So this was the shift that happened on my aggregate demand supply curve. Again, this is the same thing from the bell ringer. I'm just going off of the bell ringer shift that we did. So we've got that new thing. I'm going to call that point C. Now, when we have a decrease in SRAS, what do I do to my Phillips curve? Think. Okay, it's a change in SRAS, so I shift it, right? I have to shift the Phillips curve if I move SRAS. If I decrease SRAS, I would shift my Phillips curve in the opposite direction. So SRAS would go left, so Phillips curve goes to the right, right? Right. Because when you decrease SRAS, you get a higher unemployment rate and a higher inflation rate. So here's what I'm going to do. Watch this cool thing. I'm at point B. I need a higher inflation and a higher unemployment rate. Where would I end up? Higher of both? Oh my God, I can get back on the long run Phillips curve. And that green marker did not turn out great. That line did not turn out as clean as I wanted it to. That. Imagine the line doesn't suck as much as it does, and it's as clean as the purple line is. But the idea is you shift back to long run equilibrium on both graphs. Both graphs have you shift back to long run equilibrium. On my aggregate supply curve, it was SRES that moved back to equilibrium, right? Mentioned that that's how it works in the long run if the government's not involved, because wages can change, price level went up, so you start paying your workers more, but now you've got to fire some of them. Oh my God, it's so annoying. We get back to long run equilibrium, but we are just at a higher price level than before. Cool, same thing happened here. Started at A, had higher spending, so I moved up to B, because I'm going to have less unemployment and higher inflation. In the long run, we start paying our workers more. Okay, we have to fire some of them, so I should get higher unemployment. And if I'm paying my workers more, everything is getting more expensive. So I moved up to point C, and I am back at long run equilibrium. You can do a long run shift on both graphs. Because you change anything on the aggregate supply graph, it'll change what happens on your Phillips curve. They are meant to be reflections of one another. They're just different lenses which to view the economy through, but you're still viewing the same economy through it. So if I'm at full employment in one economy at the start, I should still be at full employment on the economy on this graph, which is at point A. If I moved off of full employment in this graph, I should move off of full employment in this graph. And if I moved back to full employment on this graph, which is what happened here at the end, I should move back to full employment on that graph. So know the shifters of the Phillips curve and realize how you can get back to your long run Phillips curve. Because if we're shifting SRAS shifts SRPC, cool, I move my SRAS to get back to equilibrium, then I should move my Phillips curve to get back to equilibrium as well. Oh my God. Now, last thing, just to make sure you have it somewhere, because I always forget to just sort of draw this, because sometimes they'll actually have you start with the Phillips curve just to freak you out, because College Board. You can show inflationary and recessionary gaps on the Phillips curve model too. I mentioned that point A would be full employment because LRPC is full employment. So if you're at that, then your economy is killing it. So if your economy is at full employment, you'd be at point A. If you're in a recession, it means that your unemployment rate is higher than what it's supposed to be. Well, cool, unemployment is my X value on this graph. So if my unemployment's higher than what it's supposed to be, and LRPC is what it's supposed to be, then my recessionary gap would be over here. Point B. So point B on this Phillips curve is a recession. This is how you would draw a recession on your Phillips curve. If it asks you to draw a recession, you would draw LRPC, SRPC, and put your equilibrium point where you are right now over here. You wouldn't put point A and draw an arrow. You just put point B. That's it. If you're in an inflationary gap, you've got higher inflation, cool, then you'd be at point C. You'd be higher up along the curve. So do a quick little like matching game in your head of, okay, full employment on my aggregate demand supply graph looks like, okay, those two are through it. On my Phillips curve, if you're trying to draw point B on your aggregate demand supply graph, that should look, I'm not labeling anything, like that. That's a recession on my aggregate demand supply graph. And this is a recession on my Phillips curve. So like make the mental connection between those 2 points. If you're like, but it's to the right on one and to the left on the other, it's like, yes, because the X values are inversely related between these two graphs. The X-axis on your aggregate demand supply graph is GDP, and GDP and unemployment are inversely related. So, If it's to the right on one graph, it'd be to the left on the other. Don't try and memorize where it is. Try to understand what a recession is. Recession means I've got a lot of unemployment. Okay, well then, point B. That's got a lot of unemployment. If trying to memorize patterns and stuff is really hard in economics, because there are about 1 billion of them, and half of them are positive related and half of them are inversely related. Trying to memorize all the relationships will break your brain. If you understand what the concepts are, the relationships will become second nature. When I mentioned the unemployment inflation thing and I started to talk about it, some of you guys should have had like clicks go off in your head of like, more people working, so there'd be more spending. Yeah, that makes sense. Good, then you understand the relationship. You could have probably pieced that together had I asked you to think about it, right? Great. If I'm telling you, hey, this is a graph, unemployment rate is the x-axis, a recession would be where? On the right? Pretty far to the right, because that would mean a lot of unemployment, which is what happens during recessions? Yes. Inflation is the y-axis. What would be an inflationary period? Pretty high y value because inflation is the y-axis? Yeah. Don't overthink it. Go off of what you understand. Knowing all the relationships is helpful, and you do need to know some of them, like GDP and unemployment. You got to know those are inversely related, but you could also understand that they're inversely related. Helps it stay in your brain better. Now, quick just side tangent for a brief second at the end. Talked a lot about inflation. I don't know if I've ever actually mentioned that there are other things that can happen. Disinflation and deflation, which are two different concepts that are important to mention. If you hear the term disinflation, that means that there is a decrease in inflation rate. Let me make this very clear. This does not mean you have negative inflation. This does not mean prices are going down. This means prices are going up slower. So, for example, we average like 2% inflation per year. If we went from 2% inflation last year to 1% inflation this year, that would be disinflation. Less inflation than before. Not negative inflation. Prices are still going up, but they're not going up by 2%, they're going up by 1%. Think of disinflation as slowing down. Deflation is negative inflation. That's going in reverse. When you're slowing down, you're not going in reverse. You're just going forward slower. When you're going reverse, you're going in the opposite direction. Things are very different. So deflation is negative inflation. That's when prices are falling. If we went like under the x-axis on your Phillips curve, we'd be seeing deflation. Not a common thing for us in America. In fact, it's almost impossible for it to happen really easily for us because Americans would typically react and start spending more. There are problems with it though, and it can happen. Problems with it are debt. Mentioned that whenever inflation happens, you as a borrower starts to benefit from that because you're paying back less in value. Well, if deflation happens, guess what happens to borrowers? They get screwed because now they're paying back more in value. Everything else is getting cheaper, and they're paying back the same amount they were before when everything was more expensive. So their debt is more expensive. That sucks. But still, you're still like, how does this even happen? It's like, well, we mentioned that expected inflation can cause inflation. Expected deflation can cause it too. Where if we think prices are going to go down by 2% next year, guess what I'm not going to do? Buy things right now. I'm going to buy as little as I can right now and do all my spending next year. Now, the problem with that is obviously that, okay, we're causing deflation to happen sooner, but once the deflation happens, wouldn't we just spend it and it would go away? Right, this is why it doesn't happen a lot for us. There is a way it can happen, though. If you're in a recession and deflation starts to happen. Because if you're in a recession, people might not have jobs or money to capitalize on those lower prices, right? In recessions, a lot of disinflation tends to happen because there is less spending going on. So you see a lot of disinflation. But once you hit deflation, it can get kind of dicey because if you've had a big enough recession, if you've had a depression, you could actually start to experience deflation, which you're like, that sounds great, Mr. McRitchie. It's like, becomes problematic. I mentioned with the debt thing that that's a problem, that if you're a borrower, it's really crappy to have deflation. But it also becomes a problem for lenders because of something called the liquidity trap, which is cut off here. It's liquidity trap. The idea being, as prices get lower and lower and lower, it becomes more and more valuable to be liquid so you can capitalize on them and buy that, meaning you have less and less money in banks. Great. But because prices are going down, interest rates also start to fall. They're price. Be aware of that. So if prices start to go down, less investing is happening, interest rates start to fall, they can't fall forever. This is the tricky part. We're like, how do we get out of deflation? Well, we need people to spend more, so we would lower interest rates, right? But they've been getting lower, and they can't go down forever. There's an issue of something called zero bound, which is that you can't have an interest rate of 0 on a loan. Because what the hell's the point of the loan then? As a lender. Like as a borrower, sick, love that. But if you're a lender, why the hell would I loan at a 0% interest rate? I'm not getting any profit off of that. I've just given you money to give it back in the future. Doesn't make any sense. So the lower the price of a loan gets, the less willing businesses are to loan, which means you can't borrow, you can't spend, you can't buy a car, a house, or go to college. Oh, prices can go up forever. That's why inflation happening every single year isn't the end of the world. Prices can't go down forever, though. There's a zero that we've got to be aware of, that as prices get lower and lower and lower and lower, as interest rates get lower and lower and lower and lower, you fall into a liquidity trap. You fall into a problem of which you can't really loan out money at all because you won't make any profit. Banks cease to exist because that's how they make money. You no longer have the ability to save your money in a secure location, and a bunch of terrifying things happen all at once. Deflation is also very bad. We don't experience it a lot because if we experienced it, it would be, for the most part, a blip on a radar unless we were in a massive economic fallout. We technically are in a massive economic fallout, but we are not really experiencing deflation because we are doing enough splurgy, dumb, spendy things to keep that from happening. Like, we're going to see a lot of disinflation this year. Prices are not going to go up as much this year as they would have supposed to. But we're still experiencing some inflation. Okay, that is it for today's video. Okay, let's go back to... No, I keep doing that. That's still the wrong one. There it is. So, sorry, that's the last little tangent. It's a thing that I didn't talk about when I covered inflation the first time that I wanted to make sure I covered at some point. The big takeaway, the Phillips curve. Inflation and unemployment are inversely related in the short run. That's sort of the caveat, because in the long run, that turned out to be not as true. It is a reflection of your aggregate demand aggregate supply curve. It is almost literally a reflection where the LRAS is like your pivot point. When I move something to the right on my aggregate demand supply curve, I move something to the left on my Phillips curve. If I move aggregate demand, I move along my Phillips curve. If I move aggregate supply, I move the whole Phillips curve. So when you're solving a Phillips curve problem, a general rule of thumb is it's not a bad idea to also sketch your aggregate demand aggregate supply graph just to help yourself. Make sure you remember the relationships, the ones that are like GDP and unemployment are inversely related. Price level and inflation are positively related. Those two are like, you need them. You need them for the Phillips curve to work. For you to make sense with it. Make sure you're aware of, okay, when you do long run stuff on your aggregate demand supply curve, you can draw it on the Phillips curve too. It also has a long run component because again, it's a reflection of that graph. It's another lens with which to view the economy as a whole. We're not looking at a specific market, like with the money market or the loanable funds market. So there wasn't the long run there because that's a market. It's a specific market. But we're talking the economy as a whole, there is a long run element because it's not just one market, it's everything. So the Phillips curve is the market, is part of everything, just like the aggregate demand supply curve is. So there's a long run sort of through line that we're trying to follow, full employment. The LRPC represents full employment. It can be changed only if you change structural and or frictional unemployment, which are what make up the LRPC. Like LRPC equals structural plus frictional is a way to think about it. We're like, I've got 2% structural and 2% frictional, so my LRPC would be at 4%. Draw it there. That kind of thing. So it's pretty rock solid. There is disinflation and deflation. The difference is that disinflation is still inflation, just less of it. Deflation is actually negative inflation. Prices are going down when there's deflation. Prices are going up slower when it's disinflation. So disinflation is slowing down. Deflation is going in reverse. And that deflation does have problems, namely that prices can't go down forever. Prices can go up forever, but prices can't go down forever because zero becomes a thing that you've got to worry about. I think that's about it, though. Yeah, that's about it. So again, make sure you're careful with your aggregate demand and aggregate supply stuff. This is a great thing to review. It's the most important graph in the course because guess what, guys? It was a part of last unit because monetary policy affected aggregate demand. Cool, it's a part of this unit because this affects the Phillips curve. So guess what, guys? I could just whenever you've had to draw an aggregate demand supply graph, ask you to draw the Phillips curve. Last unit, when we did loanable funds market, we're like, okay, so what happens to investment? Okay, so aggregate demand goes up. Cool. What happens on your Phillips curve? You're like, I move up along the Phillips curve to the left. Bingo. There are 6 graphs in the course. This is the 5th one, and it can be affected by the last 3 that we've talked about. That the aggregate demand supply curve changes it when you change the loanable funds market or the money market. It changes interest rates, which changes aggregate demand, so it changes that graph, which changes your Phillips curve. Lots of things to be aware of. The class is really connected. It's macroeconomics. It's the economy as a whole, and the economy as a whole is connected. Like crazy. Okay, that's it for today's video. I know it was a long one, but Phillips curve is an important subject, and I did long run and short run in one video, so it was bound to be a little bit longer than it needed to be. But appreciate you guys watching. Wish you all the absolute best. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.